Hello everyone, my name is Michael. I'm a senior developer evangelist at GitLab, and today I want to do a little deep dive around CI/CD observability, tracing, OpenTelemetry, and everything I've been collecting and thinking about in the past months. And to begin with, and I will link the issue in the video description later on, why are we planning to add OpenTelemetry for tracing into CI/CD? How would it work with GitLab? Which components are involved? What are the most challenging parts? And actually, where to get started? I will do a recap or like a summary in my CDCon talk, where I'm talking about how we build CI/CD observability with OpenTelemetry. This will be a snapshot of the current development stage, or rather research stage, because it has become quite a lot of things to consider. One of the things is like, why are we actually doing that? Oftentimes there is the problem that pipelines are being blocked, or you want to have specific insights, not only on the job duration inside the pipeline, but also more context, whether it might be the Docker executor having a problem, or Kubernetes, or something else. And we discussed the idea of saying, hey, we really want to have traces and spans in this regard. And there are specific ways to integrate with external tools and just execute the traces or the specific CLI, for example, from Honeycomb using build events, and then send it to an external receiver and backend, and then visualization. But over time, there has now been a standard being defined, which is called OpenTelemetry. It's a framework, it's a specification for traces, and later on metrics and logs. But for now, we will focus on tracing. One of the ideas around OpenTelemetry is that you have a generic collector service where you're just sending the traces forward to. And this is like the idea of saying, okay, within the GitLab pipeline, we want to send these traces. And so, like, to really get started, one needs to understand the flow in the traces. And for that, I would just skip from the issue, which has the proposed steps, from getting started with variables, adding it to the GitLab runner component, adding it to the GitLab server component, and just doing more inside. I will just jump quickly into my slide draft to make it a little more clear on what we are planning, or what we actually should be doing, and more on the talk soon in June. One of the most challenging parts is like where to get started. We really want to solve the problems, and the thing is, I as a user want to get feedback and want to configure that and immediately see what's going on. I'm just looking, what I actually was looking for is we need to understand the GitLab architecture. So we have the runner, which schedules the pipeline, schedules the jobs, the server, and the runner connects to the server, asks for new jobs when they are there, starts the execution, sends back the job logs, and later on, when everything is finished, uploads the artifacts and so on. The thing is, when we want to start there, the runner is much more isolated in that regard. It allows to compile a standalone binary, just execute something, and see it on the terminal, and later on as well. On the server, there is more going on. So like the pipeline is being triggered, there's a queue, the runner communicates with the server, and so on. So this can be a little tricky, but to begin with, I decided to say, okay, I want to compile the GitLab runner binary, which is written in Go, inside the job is being executed. So we're actually using the run method. We have different executors, and we can use, for example, the executors as string as a metadata for traces. So enriching the context with more data, which is not just a metric, a measurement, but instead could be any type of string or number or Boolean or whatever attribute is useful for later debugging why the pipeline could be blocking, for example, or why the runner resources are being drained. So let's start with the runner. And when I started with the runner, one of the biggest challenges is, now I need to understand how OpenTelemetry works. And from the design principles, we have the collector, which then stores the traces in Jaeger tracing later on. But for now, the challenge is really to say, I want to modify the GitLab runner code to send traces to OpenTelemetry, which is a TCP port somewhere listening. And so I started my research within the development documentation or the instrumentation documentation of OpenTelemetry, and also started looking into the GitLab runner development documentation and also the Go guide, just to get an idea of what is necessary, what is needed, and how things are working. And from there, I thought of, I need a local GitLab runner development environment, which is basically following the documentation and then understanding the make commands. I ran in some troubles, where I will be creating some merge requests and issues after finishing up. But it's pretty straightforward. One thing I couldn't make work are the helper Docker images, but at some point I saw something on the terminal which made me believe, jobs are being executed, and I can go on and do something. The other thing I did was I kind of automated the installation of the runner with a token, and also ensured that the runner is using a specific tag like OTel for OpenTelemetry, and that allows me to really see, these jobs which I'm triggering on the server are just used by this specific runner, and they're not interfering with some other configuration, because I didn't want to start with setting up the GitLab server environment, because this comes at a later point. I started out with just using or creating a playground for this specific task, which is over here in this specific group, which is just more or less documentation, or me documenting the steps and also documenting which development environment I just did, and so on. So long story short, everything is linked together also in the issue. The thing is, this repository also provides the GitLab CI configuration, which is basically just generating jobs using a matrix build and assigning the job tag, which is basically the magic. And the other magic is to trigger the pipelines always from, this is the wrong one, retry the pipelines all the time. So the idea is to just generate pipeline jobs and then see what the runner is doing, or the modified runner binary is doing later on. So this is being done over here, and the idea is really to execute the runner, which will be shown in this view, and you can see that I already tested some things, or I've been testing it for like 2 weeks now. And the other thing is, and this will come later on, is actually the OpenTelemetry collector. But for now, I can just execute the GitLab runner in debug mode, and then providing a custom configuration which defines the base images and the helper and the executors and so on. There was nothing really like special about it. I was just following the development documentation. And once I started modifying everything, I was pretty much overwhelmed by OpenTelemetry and what can I do, and I need to send traces and so on. And then I figured, well, let's take a step back and only print the traces to standard output, to std out to the console. So the OpenTelemetry Go SDK provides an std out tracer, which is super useful. You don't need to have to worry about any specific network connections or something like that. And in addition to std out, you can also save it in a file stream as a text file. But in the end, one needs to learn how to initialize the tracer and then start adding some spans, which are then printed to the console. Well, and this is like the manual instrumentation, which I did. I also ran into certain things which didn't work so well. So I was initializing the tracer and then using defer to shut it down again, which kind of didn't made it so that my traces and spans never were sent to anything. But yeah, after some hours of debugging, I figured out, oh, I'm doing it totally wrong. And I also got some ideas around how to improve the documentation and help make this a better experience for everyone else in the future. Long story short, the idea was to really like make it work on standard output. But once I got the idea of, hey, I can see something, and just to give you an idea what I actually did in the beginning, was to set up the instrumentation, which works in a similar fashion as with the, let me see, the metrics server and everything else, which is already implemented in the GitLab runner. It's actually over here. The run command is getting executed, and then the metrics and debug server and so on is started. And I just injected the OpenTelemetry instrumentation method in there. In the beginning, and the merge request where I'm currently writing code in will also be linked. In the beginning, I just started adding the std out tracer and tried to figure out which attributes I would be needed to be setting. So like, what is with sampler? What does with batcher mean? What is a resource? So there were so many new terms to learn when using the SDK. I sometimes felt blocked in the way of saying I don't know what's next, and then I just copied something which I found in a different blog or a different code example until everything was working. Now, looking at the diff, it looks pretty short, but the way getting there was not so short. In the end, once I saw that the std out traces have been working thus far, I decided, okay, let's move on to the next step. Let's actually store the traces in Jaeger. Jaeger tracing is basically a collector and a storage with Elasticsearch, Kafka, or ClickHouse in the backend, and it allows you to search for traces and visualize them and so on. And in connection with OpenTelemetry, one can actually collect, or you can send the traces to the OpenTelemetry collector, and the OpenTelemetry collector sends them to Jaeger tracing. That's basically the setup. And before doing so, I wanted to again take a step back and say, I'm first sending something to the OpenTelemetry collector, because I learned from the documentation that you don't need to have a backend. You can just use the logging exporter, which then sends everything to standard output on the console, and you can also enable debug logging. So you basically see everything which is going on and happening when traces are being sent over. And after I had this success moment, I said, okay, what is next? How can I bring up Jaeger tracing with the OpenTelemetry collector with for example, ClickHouse as a backend. And yesterday I started out and say, okay, I want to use the OpenTelemetry operator, the Jaeger operator, the ClickHouse operator in Kubernetes. But for some reason, I couldn't make it work. It was something like ports were not exposed and some TLS issues. And for today, I said, well, let's take a step back and focus on a local setup, which was not only done using this binary compilation, but just focusing on what's needed for a Docker Compose setup. The OpenTelemetry contrib project has an example which also uses different traces and metrics and everything else. I removed everything which is not needed and just focused on actually adding in there and just navigating over here, adding the specific things I need, the Jaeger tracing all-in-one container exposing the ports, and the OpenTelemetry collector, which exposes 2 different ports. This is important. 4317 is for gRPC and 4318 is for HTTP. One can use both. I started with HTTP, it didn't work, and then I switched to gRPC, and then it did work, thus require me to use an insecure mode with TLS, which is not recommended, but for development and debugging, I just went this route. Now, after having started the Docker Compose setup, I also needed to ensure that the specific port where the gRPC service is listening on, which is strangely mapped with Rancher Desktop over here, but it doesn't matter. It's running, it's working, and it's storing data, and it also exposes the Jaeger tracing UI, which we can see over here. And clicking on Find Traces, I've selected a custom time range. I have a specific service already. I have no idea why this is called no service name, because within the code, I've configured a service name. But yeah, from the from the implementation specific side, the idea is to send the traces, which are now instrumented in the code, to OpenTelemetry using gRPC. And for that, and this is like seen on the slide, which is not that huge, but within Visual Studio Code, you can see the instrumentation. This is just for debug logging in the SDK. It sets a context and then creates a new OpenTelemetry trace gRPC client, sets the insecure mode, not recommended, and also overrides the endpoint because for some reason it didn't use my default, or it didn't read the environment variables. But I decided I want to debug this later, just use what I set manually, and then it's creating a new exporter, registering the tracer provider, and using a batcher. And so basically everything has been set up, and the most important things or the most important changes are actually done in, for example, the process runner method, where the tracer is being started with process runner and specific events are being added. So after having set the executor provider, having it acquired, and what else? And the build has been acquired, and I tried to add some more descriptive things with using the string for the runner name and the worker ID as an integer, just to see what is possible with adding more context and more metadata to the traces and spans. Now, this is a little complex, but in the end, it's just a small code addition to really send some traces out of GitLab runner when something is being executed towards OpenTelemetry and then Jaeger. In order to show what is going on here, it will be needed to actually execute the runner, which I will be doing in this terminal using the GitLab runner binary and the configuration I've prepared. and this kind of looks like this. And when I scroll a little back, I can see there are some variables configured, and it will be using this one for a local host and the port mapping, and initializes the trace with specific attributes. And I need to analyze that. Maybe that explains certain other issues I've seen. Now, when the runner is being executed, it connects to the server and there is nothing going on. There are some internal logging things you can see, which is like the SDK being set to debug log, which helps to see, oh, there are some spans being collected and things are happening already. Now, the runner is connected to, this is the diff, to this project. And I won't show you the settings now because there is the runner token in there. But we can retry the pipeline. And the pipeline is running, and we should be seeing lots of jobs being executed. And then there is like the issue with the failed helper image because it requires a certain tag. And but I haven't bothered with it that much. So it says it's exporting spans. And when we navigate over here into the Jaeger UI, actually, you can see find traces, and we have traces. We can also not just limit the resource to 20. Let's say, just show us what you got. 86 traces in the last 2 minutes, or whenever I started the GitLab runner. So it's sending something, and as you can see, it's sending process runner as a trace, and it has one span inside, which is great because I didn't map anything else, but we can see different execution times already, which is already super amazing, at least for me, first success. And now when we want to like navigate into the trace and the span, we can see the timeline here, and what happens? We can see, yeah, the Docker message and so on. But let's just click on this and look inside. What did we set? Yeah, the client library name is specifically set to gitlab-org/gitlab-runner. And I think you can set more to that. The added events, which I showed you earlier, we are getting the executor, then we acquired it, and we have acquired the build. The runner ID is this one, and the worker is number 2. Let's see if we can like see a different span, maybe with different worker, still worker number 2. Maybe one can filter by that. I haven't really figured out how this works on the front end yet. Still, it's a great way to visualize that. Now, the thing is, this is just the first step of seeing something and getting something to work. And when I show you the code or the things I'm doing currently, there are many to-dos and things inside. So this really needs cleanup and more thinking. And it's also too early to really push a draft MR to the upstream repository at this moment, because I'm not sure if this proof of concept actually works, especially when navigating into what's next, what's coming, because this needs to be done for the GitLab runner, adding more context, adding more things which could be interesting as an MVC. But we also need to ensure that the entire platform, the DevOps platform, actually supports CI/CD observability. So the server needs to be added as well. And this is after the first success now with the GitLab runner and providing proof it works with Jaeger tracing and OpenTelemetry. I will focus on the server development environment, getting things up, investigate and research in the OpenTelemetry Ruby SDK for the server components, dive into the code for the pipeline execution backend, which I haven't done with before, and I'm curious to learn and see how far I can get with the documentation and starting my own contribution journey. And as an MVC, I'm thinking about pipeline start end for a span and job start end for a span. There is much more to that, but one really needs to see something. And as a challenge, combining the two, because when we start a trace on the server, so the pipeline is getting started, the jobs are being executed, and then the runner executes the jobs, this needs to be combined into a single trace. So we want to see from the server starting the pipeline job, the runner is executing the job, returning to the server the next job, and so on. This should be within one trace, and we really want to see which span is taking the longest, and so on. And this also needs some testing and some tryouts with what is best for a trace, starting it, ending it, and so on. And also for visualization. For now, we're using I'm using the Jaeger tracing frontend. We might be doing something different with ops trace and the integration, which is on the long run, on the long roadmap. But for now, it's really just having a development environment which can be set up rather easy. But hopefully in the future, there will be more to that. Other challenges are like not only instrumenting the GitLab runner and the GitLab server code, but also allowing users to run a CLI or something else, or within the domain-specific language in the configuration to execute something and say, this is for me starting a new span, and I can kind of instrument my CI/CD YAML configuration. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's an idea, and it's one of my future goals to also evaluate this possibility, which requires learning the DSL and other things, obviously, other parts of GitLab. Now, the other thing is, like, when the deployment is done and the CI/CD job is being executed, the agent for Kubernetes might be running, and then the application is running, maybe in a staging environment, maybe in production environments. We also need to continue with OpenTelemetry, with tracing, with observability. So this is another long-term goal to achieve. And I'm kind of giving the talk I will be recording soon. It's a good practice for you to get an update. The thing is, there are other things like security and multi-tenancy. So which data can we actually expose from within GitLab Runner and GitLab Server to an external tracing endpoint? How much possibilities to leak something? Can we kind of limit the configuration to a specific small group? Multi-tenancy in a sense of limiting what can be sent where. So like you don't see everything, but only for your group or for your project on gitlab.com. On the SaaS platform and for self-managed, also a challenge, just to ensure that not only admins or the ones who own the platform or the instance see the traces, but also users can actually debug their pipelines and see how long the jobs are being run and why and so on. So this is something we need to try out and discuss also with our product engineering and security teams to really figure out what's the best way to move forward. Which also brings in the problem or the idea of, hey, we're not a small instance. We might be running lots of jobs, lots of pipelines, lots of executors and things. How does tracing being enabled by default actually affect what's going on with the performance on the GitLab instance or on the SaaS platform? And this is something I don't know. So will it be enabled by default? Can everyone just enable it? Will it be like will it need certain quotas or things like that? It's still a proof of concept, so we will need to do benchmarks and reviews and different test scenarios and so on. So me now sharing this update doesn't mean it will be finished in 1 month, 2 months, whatever months. It's just great to really being able to provide an update now. And I will dive more into all the ideas and things which are also documented in the issue. But for now, let's just focus on that. And beyond that, I've mentioned it in the beginning, OpenTelemetry also supports metrics and logs in the future. So we might be changing how metrics instrumentation works. Everyone needs to learn and adopt this. Maybe moving from Prometheus/metrics endpoints, moving to OpenTelemetry makes sense. We also need to consider using it within GitLab, and this ties into using LabKit for Go and Ruby instrumentation from within GitLab and see if that can be combined, the effort, so not to duplicate the work. For now, the proof of concept is not focusing on looking into what LabKit is currently doing and our SREs, but this also needs collaboration and then discussion on what is actually possible. When I will be having the first test MRs, I will sure be reaching out. For now, it's really too early, too soon to discuss whether to merge it or where to go. Yeah, and this has been running for a while now, potentially generating new traces somehow. Yeah. I will continue working on this for a little while and figuring out what other data I can provide, and then kind of freeze the Go code for now and focus on Ruby potentially tomorrow or next week. I will be at KubeCon in 1.5 weeks. Potentially I don't have time to hack on this, but if there is time, I'm happy to do some hacking maybe, or some discussing some ideas in person if someone is there. And yeah, as said, I will link the video, the issue in the video description and vice versa, providing an update in here, and everything else is public. So if you want to read on what I'm experiencing and what I'm documenting, you can follow along over here, as well as in the development environment guides, how to set up things and so on. So everything is documented, like noted in here. Yeah, and with that, thanks for watching and see you soon in the next update.